If you want a miracle, you're going to have to move. Turn over to Mark chapter number 5. Verse number 25. We're going to begin reading there. Say amen when you get there. Half of you over there. All right. And there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years and who had endured much suffering under the hands of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, instead grew worse. So she heard the reports concerning Jesus, and she came up behind him in the throng and touched his garment. For she kept saying, if I could only touch his garment. If I could only get to Jesus. She showed faith, even in her words. She said, if I could only get to Jesus, I know that I would be healed. And verse number 29 said, and immediately her flow of blood was dried up at the source, and suddenly she felt in her body that she was healed of her distressing ailment. Verse number 30, and Jesus, recognizing in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around immediately in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? And the disciples looked at him and they said, Lord, what are you talking about? There's hundreds of people pressing against you. How in the world, why are you asking us who's touching? We don't know. There's bunches of people trying to push through here. And this woman was weak from her ailment. And she pressed through that crowd. And in my mind, I can see her falling down and crawling and pressing and pushing her way until she reached and touched the hem of his garment. And Jesus felt the virtue come from him. He turned around and said, who touched me? And in the Amplified Bible, it says that the woman was trembling with fear because she didn't know how he was going to respond to her grabbing his clothes. And she fell down at his feet and said, Lord, it was I. And I said in my spirit, if I could just get to you and touch you, that I would be made whole. She needed a miracle, but she had to move to get it. She could have sat down by the side of the road and screamed and cried out to Jesus and said, Lord, please come over here and heal me. She may have never received her healing. But because of her persistence and because that she was willing to press through that crowd with the last bit of strength that she had in her body and reach out and grab a hold of the hem of his garment, because she moved, she was healed. Turn over to the book of Luke, chapter number 18. We're going to begin reading at verse number 35. And he came near to Jericho, or as he came near to Jericho, it occurred that a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging, and hearing a crowd going by, he asked what it meant. And they told him that Jesus of Nazareth, this is the blind man, they told the blind man that Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And he shouted, saying, Jesus, the King James Version said, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. And he cried out. And they tried to get him to be quiet. And man, shut up, because they were afraid he was going to disturb Jesus. And the word says that he cried out the more, saying, Jesus, thou son of David. Amplified says, take pity and have mercy on me. But those that were in front reproved him, telling him to keep quiet. Yet he screamed and shrieked so much the more, Son of David, please have mercy on me. Then Jesus stood still and ordered that he be led to him. And when he came near, Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Now, don't you think that Jesus knew what that man needed? Since he's all-knowing, don't you think that he already knew? Why did he ask that man, what do you want me to do for you? He wanted that man to respond in faith, because he knew if he could get him to tell him what he wanted him to do, that it would create some faith in his heart. He required that man to do something in order to receive his healing. He could have just moved his hand towards him and healed him instantly. He could have made another dramatic display and healed him with something like he did earlier in this story that I just shared with you. But he said, what would you have me to do for you? He said, Lord, that I may receive my sight. And Jesus said, receive your sight. What do you want him to do for you this morning? How long has it been since you've cried out to him, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me? How long has it been since you've cried out to him and told him about your infirmity? How long has it been since you've reached out to him and said, Lord, I've got a situation in my home that I need help. Lord, please help me. And reached out with some kind of faith. How long has it been since you moved? You're going to have to move in order to get your miracle. Sometimes the Lord will require something of you. Mark chapter number 2. There was a paralytic. Chapter number 2, verse number 1. We're going to begin reading here. And Jesus, having returned to Capernaum after some days, it was rumored about that he was in the house, probably Peter's. And so many people gathered together that there was no longer room for them, not even around the door. And he was discussing the word, he was teaching them. Verse number 3, then they came bringing a paralytic to him who had been picked up and was being carried by 4 men. When they could not get him to the place in front of Jesus because the crowd was so great they couldn't get him through the door, you know the story. They went up and took him up on the roof. Now, we're talking about real faith here, folks. Most folks would say, we can't get in there. You know, we've gone to the Benny Hinn meeting, or we've gone to the healing meeting. We can't get in the door. Let's just go home. They could have packed up and took the man back home. This man was not able to move for himself, so God put some people in his life that were able to have faith enough to get him to where he needed to be. How many of you got people in your life that God's placed in your life for a reason? And when you couldn't have the faith to believe for yourself, when you couldn't muster up enough faith within your own abilities to reach out and touch God, the phone would ring and they'd say, hey, God laid me on your heart this morning. I want you to know that I believe in God with you and I'm praying with you. This man had some folks that were willing to go the extra mile for him. And that's what we need to be doing here at Glad Tidings Assembly of God. We need to be keenly aware of what's going on around us. And when we see someone in need, a friend or a brother or sister in the Lord, and they can't have the faith for themselves, then it's up to us to believe for them and do whatever is necessary to move them to the place where they can receive their miracle. How many of you believe that this morning? These men went up on top of the roof and they tore a hole in this guy's roof. Now, I'm sure he's probably pretty upset about that. But they tore a hole in the roof. Now, how many of you think you'd have the faith if you came to this church bringing somebody that was on a stretcher and you couldn't get in the door because there were so many miracles happening that the crowd was so great? How many of you think you'd have the faith to get a ladder, climb up on the building, and tear a hole through this roof to get that person down to where Jesus was? I'm not sure how many of us would be willing to do that. But these men tore a hole in the roof and let this man... Now, they had to think about this thing a little bit because they couldn't just drop that stretcher down through that ceiling in front of Jesus. They let that man down. They had to have some rope or some way to let him down through that roof to where Jesus was. And as a result of their action, this man received his healing that day. Amen. Jesus could have healed the gentleman that he asked, what would you have me to do for you? And he said, Lord, that I might receive my sight. Jesus could have healed all of his infirmities. Whatever was going on in his life, he could have healed everything that was wrong with him at that very moment. But he asked him, what do you want me to do for you? What is it that you want me to do for you? I want you to think about that this morning. What is it that you want God to do for you today in this service this morning? What is it that you've been believing God for that you need Him to move in your behalf for today? What is going on in your finances or in your marriage or with your children that you need God to answer for you today? Let me take that a step further. What are you willing to do? How much are you willing to move toward God to see that happen this morning?